Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time frame you're in. Thank you for attending the fall program of ACRL's Digital Badge Interest Group. We hope that you'll enjoy the program we have for you today, and we're very excited about it. One thing we just want to highlight that today is Native Women's Equity Pay Day, and we just want to make sure that you are aware of that. And it's something that we try to do all the time when we do our programs to highlight certain aspects of the day. I want to introduce to you our Digital Badge Interest Group leadership team. My name is Michael Gutierrez. I'm the current convener. Wendy Pothier is our past convener, and Emily Rimland is our incoming convener. And if you want to join our team, we are recruiting for the incoming convener. If you seek to be part of our team, it's a fun team, I assure you. We have a lot of fun coming up with the programs and just researching some of our participants and our presenters. So if you didn't know, the Digital Interest Group is now over 500 active members, and we do 2 programs in the spring and the fall. And we are looking for an incoming convener beginning July 23rd. If you are interested, please contact me by May 1st. And this will be another announcement coming out in our listserv in the coming year. So today's presentation is The Badge is Half the Battle. Digital badging as a training motivation. And today's presenter is Jennifer Wright. And Jennifer is the Assistant County Librarian of Public Services with Spartanburg County Public Libraries in South Carolina. She previously held the title of Director of Planning and Training, and prior to that move into public libraries was the director of a small university library. Jennifer holds an MLIS from the University of South Carolina and an MS in Management and Leadership from the Western Governors University. And she is currently a doctoral candidate. Jennifer will present, and then we will have a Q&A after the presentation. So if you could just hold your questions until that Q&A, we would really appreciate it. So having said that, I will turn it over to Jen.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here. I am about to share my screen, if you'll bear with me for a moment, and then I'll kind of, I guess, reintroduce myself. All right. So at this point, you should be able to see my screen, and please let me know, any of the moderators, if you see any issues there or I have any audio issues. Here in South Carolina, it's a rather stormy day, and our internet here at the library is not always solid in the best of times. So please let me know if there are any issues with audio or anything else. All right. So I've already been introduced, but I'll kind of do that again. My name is Jennifer Wright. I'm so excited for the opportunity to speak to you today. It really is an honor. The title of my presentation is The Badge is Half the Battle, Digital Badging as Training Motivation. So as you might guess from that title, the primary focus of my work with badges has been as a motivator to get staff, which in my case is public library employees, to complete different types of training. And these include both our librarians and our support staff, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And also includes both required and recommended training for working in our particular public library setting. I will say that I feel as though probably a large percentage of the attendees today actually know a lot more about badging and micro-credentialing than I do. So I will be happy to hear your comments and questions at the end, and I will do my best to answer questions pertaining to what I talk about today. But I just want to acknowledge this is not my area of expertise, although it's certainly sort of a passion project for me. And I'm getting just a little bit of lag on the PowerPoint presentation. Please let me know if that causes any issues for you. I know I was just introduced, but this slide includes another brief summary of my professional educational background. So I was asked to present today because in 2020, I wrote an article titled Learning During a Pandemic, the Impact of Digital Badges on Staff Training. And that was published in, I think, 2021 in the South Carolina Libraries Journal. And that article stemmed from my position at the time, which was Director of Planning and Training. And in that role, I was learning a lot and rolling out a new management system, a learning management system, rather, which I will call an LMS, because learning management system is just a lot to say and I can never say it. So an LMS, and it had a badging and leaderboard component. And I'll talk more specifically about that experience later in the presentation. I do want to talk a little bit about Spartanburg libraries. I want to just be very sort of forthright for those coming from a public library in the United States perspective, because I'd like to explain a little bit about our library system and acknowledge that not every library system has the resources that we have. I think it's important to be transparent in any kind of presentation about who we are, what we're doing, and what we're capable of, and also our limitations, which I'll discuss as well. I know there are a lot of folks, even in my state, South Carolina, who don't have significant training resources. So that's important to acknowledge. So who we are is, we are in a county in the United States in South Carolina. By the way, I noticed someone on here attending is from Canada, and that's really exciting because I'm originally from Canada as well, from Sudbury, Ontario. So welcome. But I'm down here in South Carolina now. We do have a large county. It's a dense suburban and rural county, and we're seeing a lot of investment. We have a lot of investment, particularly from industry, like BMW is a big one here, and they just announced significant development down in the Woodruff area, which is within our county as well. Our library is fairly old for the area. It was founded back in 1885. We have a main library and then 9 satellite libraries and a bookstore. So I realize that for some states and locations, we are not a large library. For us being here in South Carolina, we are. So we have about 215 staff. We have volunteers, interns, friends of the library. And then this is where I believe that we are very privileged. We have a training department that actually has 3 staff. I'm no longer part of that department, but we now have another director there, and they do have a designated budget. And that budget allows us to do things like have an LMS, send people to some conferences and things like that. And I know some librarians here in South Carolina who are doing, training, HR, covering the reference desk, all of that. So we are very fortunate to have that training capacity. That being said, I will say, and I'm going to talk about this later in the presentation, I do believe that badging at a public library is something you can implement even if you don't have significant funds at your disposal. I believe there's some creative strategies that anyone can use. And I do kind of talk about that in the article as well. All right, so if you saw my background, you know that I've been working on a dissertation. In fact, I just turned in the draft of the completed dissertation. So I honestly am not looking to do a ton of research beyond that right now. So this slide is by no means a comprehensive summary of this topic. Again, I feel like many folks in this room, this virtual room, are even more familiar than I am with the topic. There are plenty of researchers and writers who have also done literature reviews, which if you haven't read, it makes some interesting reading. So instead, I've just included a few quotes from articles I found interesting in the recent years, and you can see these on this slide. So I have noticed that badging and microcredentialing for a long time now, they've been discussed as exciting, new, innovative, but now the concepts have kind of been around for a while, if not in libraries, at least in some other industries. And what I'm always looking for with a trend, if you will, is when the novelty starts to wear off and we actually start to see real practical research on the topic, especially quantitative research. And I feel like we're really moving in that direction. And so research has started to find, as I'm sure you know, that the use of badges in some situations, some students, some of the time, all those research caveats there, they do have positive outcomes on learning. And so my interest was sort of bringing this into the public library arena. And as with any kind of sociological phenomenon, badging, you know, as a training or teaching aid, it is such a complex phenomena to measure. However, I think we can start to talk more confidently about some benefits. So on this slide, I just have a few of those, again, kind of coming through my public library lens. I just want to acknowledge that. So I'll break down my own research in a moment, but overall, badges do seem to increase the motivation of staff to complete training, both required training and then training that they can voluntarily complete. I do think that with required training, especially if you're in a public library setting where there's no grade or anything like that for passing a training, unless you're going to switch to punitive methods when someone doesn't complete their required training, you have to get creative about getting people to motivate themselves and take that initiative to complete their training, whether that's on an annual basis or as a new employee. So in the context of my library system, required training topics would include things like certain safety and security procedures, our customer service philosophy, the practicalities of our library services, EDI, so that is equity, diversity, and inclusion, or you may hear it DEI as well. And then of course, personnel policies, legalities, things like that. And badging does seem to motivate our staff, as I'll discuss later, to complete their training in a more timely manner. I also think, and this is the second point there on the slide, that having a structure for gamification and competition through badging does help build community at work. At least in our case, it really it generated a lot of conversation, people sort of having conversations about the training, the badges. So that was an interesting benefit just practically. And then I do also believe that although badges are great for even just soft skills training, like stress relief, wellness courses, anything like that, they can be used more formally to help individuals create pathways to special projects, to promotions, to more responsibility without having to do things like go back to school. And I want to discuss that a bit more as well in a moment. All right, so I also want to talk about problems. I'll get into some of the very detailed practical problems that we ran into here a little bit later, but I wanted to acknowledge some just upfront issues with badging. So as I've touched on earlier, I do think the data about the effectiveness of badging, whether that's training completion that results in long-term learning or motivation, that's research is still fairly sparse, I think we have to admit, and some of it is a bit conflicting. Like I said, I don't claim to have comprehensive knowledge of the topic, but I think because there is an element of human psychology in this, we may see some conflicting research for a long time, just because psychology is so complex. So that means this leads us to the middle point here, that employers and educators, I think, still have mixed reactions, mixed willingness to invest in and use badging and microcredentials, especially in this kind of public library environment where it just hasn't been done a lot. Those can be ingrained attitudes that just take a long time to change. And then, as I have acknowledged already, I do want to mention again that a potential problem for badging is that you're facing technology, budget, and staffing barriers to badging in many libraries. My lens is primarily the United States, but also even in other countries, there are further problems or struggles that need to be addressed if you're going to get into this as a public library. All right, so something that I just briefly touched on in the article, and I don't want to completely rehash the article because I realize people could go out and read it, but I also don't want to assume that anyone has read it. So we actually did an initial foray, if you will, into badging when I first started as director of training. And that would have been probably like 7-8 years ago when we were doing this. We started with physical pins. We didn't have at that point the software that could support badging. And honestly, I think I just was not creative enough to come up with a digital solution on my own at that time, although I'm sure we could have come up with something just even in Google Documents or anything like that. But we went with the physical pins, and I've included a few examples of those on the side of the slide here. These are items that you can purchase. There is some cost involved, but you can purchase them from various types of websites. And the details on this are a little bit fuzzy for me now because it has been so long, but something that kind of made me laugh when I was preparing for this presentation is that I was talking to a staff member and saw them wearing one of these pins, and it's got to have been, 7 years ago at least that they received that. So these were a big hit with some people. We would tie them to different types of training or different types of tasks, and people would wear them around sort of as a badge of honor. I do think there is a unique value to a tangible badge, and that's the last thing I'm going to talk about today is some future directions for that here at SCPL. But that was just sort of a trial run. What we always really wanted to do was do digital badging for our training. So this is where the content of my article comes in. So basically, like everyone else, around mid-March 2020, the bottom dropped out and we closed our doors due to the global COVID-19 pandemic. So we were fortunate, very privileged, because our staff, we were able to keep them on and not lay off our staff, but we had them working at home on various things. And so one of the things that a lot of people were doing was lots and lots of training. And it was kind of serendipitous, if you will, because at the same time, we had already planned to purchase and roll out an LMS. It was not the first time we had an LMS here at this library. And then in my previous job, I've rolled one out. So I've rolled out probably about 4 of these LMSs in my life, and I'm hoping I never have to do it again. But the timing was great on this one. We realized that the in-person training that we normally just kind of prided ourselves on wasn't going to happen. So now we had to go completely virtual. So as I get into talking about digital badging and the LMS, I want to acknowledge a few things. I feel like I've gone to presentations and so forth before that aren't really realistic about the cost of certain pieces of software or not transparent. So I do want to talk about our learning management system. I'm not going to get into the specifics of setting it up, but I'm always happy to talk to someone if you're actually setting up an LMS, especially for a public library. It's quite a challenge, and I'm happy to give advice if anyone wants that. But primarily, I want to talk about just the resources involved. So the learning management system we were using is called Docebo, and it costs $13,000 per year for access for 215 employees or so. And that is based on the number of employees that you have. So unless you're familiar with digital subscriptions, there may be some sticker shock there. But quite frankly, I have found that other learning management systems are often even more expensive than that. And the more functionality you want, then the higher the price, obviously. So during the pandemic, we were only doing digital learning, and we have returned to in-person trainings now as well. But at this time that I did practical research related to this, we only had online courses. Some of them were live webinars, some of them were recorded webinars, items we had purchased, items that were, publicly available, things like that. So we built up quite a course catalog. Again, quite a Herculean effort to build up an LMS from scratch, but it was well worthwhile. And then the final component of that was setting up the badges themselves. And that in the software that we had involved creating a title, a description, assigning them a point value that we thought was fair, and identifying and uploading an appropriate graphic for the icon, which actually takes way more time than you would ever think. And even something like creating a title and description that would be engaging for staff and make them want the badge and want to complete the training. Just there was a lot of thought that went into that, perhaps more so than I even initially thought there would be. This is an example, and I think I used the same example in the related article just because I love animals, but this was a training related to how to handle animal situations in the library. If you don't work in a public library, I don't know how many times you run into this, but we've had snakes wander in, we've had dogs wander in, we've had people's emotional support bunnies. So we have a whole policy and training for people about how to handle this, and we try to make it lighthearted. So this example on here is the animal wrangler badge. And then there's a screenshot of some of the other badges behind that. As staff collect these badges, they can see them displayed on their homepage in the LMS. They're not connected to any other type of reward outside the LMS. It's completely virtual. This initiative launched just at the beginning of June 2020. So at the time, we were just starting to reopen with limited services. And frankly, our staff were undergoing tremendous stress. I can attest that we administrators were as well. And so I think that having these badges to complete was something fun and enjoyable that motivated staff even more than they would have been already. Although I will say we've always had staff who are extremely engaged in training and very invested in that and wanting to complete different trainings. But I do think part of the popularity that I found had to do with the timing of this related to the COVID-19 pandemic. All right, so a few numbers. At the time that I wrote this article, I had not spent a lot of time on statistics. I hadn't studied them in a while, and now I'm overwhelmed with statistics due to my current studies. But so I didn't do like an in-depth statistical analysis of this, but these are the numbers. I took a 45-day period from the launch of the new badging component, and we had 650 courses in the LMS at that time, and I focused on 493 that had activity. So activity would count as someone clicking on it, looking at it, starting it, or finishing it. And so my goal in looking at just the ones with activity was to see, is there a difference between ones that have activity and are not associated with the badge, and then the ones that have a badge? And of course, I was looking to see if that might be motivation for a staff member to complete a particular course. So for the analysis that I did for the article, I mainly focused on courses that were optional as well, because I was really looking to see that level of motivation. Sometimes if a course is required, you don't know if that's bringing its own motivation. So I just tried to really narrow it down as much as I could to focus on, is this motivating people to complete a course that they otherwise would not have done? So this is what I found. 51 of the courses were associated with badges. And of the ones that didn't have badges, 90 of them had no completions at all. People had started them but not finished them. But if you looked at the ones that had badges, they were 4 times more likely to be completed if they were connected to a badge, 4 times. So that also meant that an average of 8 staff completed each badged course during this time, while an average of only 2 staff completed the courses that did not have a badge. So that's a lot of sort of numbers and semantics, but overall, I think that key statistic to me was that a course was 4 times more likely to be completed, not just started even, but completed if it was connected to a badge. And so that was very interesting to me. And I felt like it provided a clear answer that at some level, for most staff, the badging was motivating them to complete training. And that was particularly helpful because I intentionally connected trainings to these badges that we really wanted people to do. For example, safety training, right? Because we were in the middle of the pandemic. And we continue to see, although as I've mentioned, I am no longer in training, but we do continue to see the badges as motivating factors. I don't have recent statistics to share with you, but I want to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, what we're seeing now. But definitely, I was excited by these results at that time, and I think that's reflected in the article. So the other thing about doing a presentation like this is I feel like it's incumbent on me to be very honest and forthright about challenges as well. And so that is our next slide. So I've divided this into 2 different sections. One is initial issues and one is long-term issues. So one of the first issues we encountered was people moving through a lot of courses at a very suspicious speed. That made me think they weren't completely absorbing all the information. The LMS we have is built so that there's some measures in place that people can't just click through a training, but they still can in certain ways. And so that was a big question in my mind. It was difficult to assess though, because at the time, so many people were doing work from home. They had extra time to do training because we weren't doing all our public services due to the pandemic. And that actually leads to another problem that we encountered, which was that as the library started to reopen after the pandemic, or during, as the pandemic progressed, really, some staff, usually public facing staff, they ended up having less time to do training and special projects. They were back out on the desk. And so we had this leaderboard, and the perception was that it was unfair. Some staff had more time to move up the leaderboard and others didn't, which, sure, that was true. I also think that the leaderboard was both good and bad because people became very invested in moving up the leaderboard. And again, that leads me to, that question of how can we measure retention and application of learning, which I think is an incredible struggle for any kind of training department, but especially I think in public libraries where historically we just haven't done a lot of that. Then from a long-term perspective, there are some additional issues. So new employees starting now, they have a long way to go if they want to get on this leaderboard. We have a high number of badges now in the system added by our training department, and they were added to maintain interest, but I do think that we have too many available possibly. I almost would suggest, but I'll also talk about the problems with this, I might suggest that we rotate old badges out and maybe on a yearly basis have new badges come in and reset the leaderboard so that people are inspired to kind of start over each year. However, the issue with that is twofold. One, staff are very invested in the badges that they've gotten. They would not be happy if those just disappeared. So we've been, kind of playing around with those ideas and how we could fix that somehow. But the other downside to kind of resetting badges periodically is that we are actually wanting to get into more extensive micro-credentialing. As I'm sure many of you know, there's been a long history in libraries of a bias in the form of formal degrees, and we are one of many libraries that has tried to change our degree requirements for jobs in order to attract more diverse staffing to our organization. So one path to that would be to set up micro-credentialing and create an opportunity for people to complete a pathway to a particular job or a promotion. And in order to do that through our LMS, we certainly wouldn't want to remove those badges after people had completed them. So there's just a lot of practical complexity to this, and just running it long term, you start to see more of the challenges. And I think the lesson for me has been that a badging program needs a lot of forethought, and then also you just have to be willing to completely change and reinvent it periodically to keep it relevant and motivating for staff. And I'd love to hear anyone's ideas about if you've been doing something like this, or you have thoughts about long-term running one of these programs. All right, just a couple more slides. I do, this slide requires some explanation. I don't know if anyone remembers this film, but there's an emerging trend in my workplace that reminds me of this film, and it's called Office Space. To me, it's a classic movie. It's kind of dated now, but whenever I see people wearing lanyards that have a lot of pins or buttons on them, I'm reminded of the movie Office Space and how the servers called their buttons FLAIR, their FLAIR. So one thing that I have noticed recently is almost a generational thing where a lot of our younger staff in particular are very, very invested in creating or collecting pins and buttons to wear on their lanyard at work. And It's interesting. So we have button makers around the system. The price on those has come way down. They're super popular both with staff and patrons. And so staff are making their own buttons. We also have started doing more of these enamel pins. We've done them for some special author events. Our EDI, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee has a Reading Broadly book club that they do, and they've started offering pins for people who complete that. So people are collecting these, and actually, you know, you try to do nice things for your staff, and some things you fall flat, and some things are wildly popular. We purchased lanyards for all staff that had our logo on them, and they're a little bit wider, and people have just loved those items. And so I'm starting to think about capitalizing on this popularity, and that our training department should get in here and go back to doing it in some format, perhaps physical badges and pins as motivation for completing trainings that also reflect perhaps the badge and the LMS. I realize there's a cost there, but it's just been an emerging idea for me, because I think that it's fascinating how certain things come in and out of style. And right now, at least at our library, buttons and badges and pins are super in style, and people love to customize those and kind of show their personality. So in conclusion, I am no expert on this really at all. I do believe that my experience, my research has shown that badges do motivate some public library staff learners. I think that digital and physical badges can work. And then I think change and variety are really, really key, especially in the digital world. And then I just sort of have, this is almost a rhetorical question. The other thing that I have been thinking a lot about is about the decline in college enrollment, which you may have heard about. It is pretty significant in some areas. And so what's the role of badges and micro-credentials in the future for the library profession, and for people to move up within an organization without having to go back to school, because there's so many barriers to that. So I think that's just a fascinating discussion, which I'm sure those of you who are interested in badging and micro-credentialing have already had. But in the context of public library, I think that would warrant some further study and experimentation. All right, so that is all that I had to say. I really appreciate your inviting me here again. I hope that this was worthwhile to listen to. I will do my best to answer any questions you have if it's within the scope of my knowledge. So at this time, if y'all want to let me know, I think the moderators are going to read me the questions.
Yeah.
Okay,
Thank
awesome.
you, Jennifer. That was great. I have one question while you catch your breath, and if others have questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll get to them. But I have a question about can you expand a little bit more on how you used competition as a motivator in badging? Can you comment on that a little bit more?
Yes. So, and part of this was just informed by the type of software we had. It had a built-in leaderboard. You assign a point value to each badge. So a course that was longer, of course, might have more points to it, or a badge that was composed of multiple courses might have more points to it. And so the competition feature was really built in. Those points were tallied for the staff, and then they would show up in a leaderboard within the LMS, and people could see, you know, they could put their little picture on their account and they could see their name on the leaderboard and whether they were moving up or down. That seemed to really motivate some people. Now, there is another functionality in Docebo that we did not use, which is it's almost like a reward system. You can link it to contests and physical rewards. And I just did not think that would be fair to implement, because as I mentioned, some people ended up having a lot more time to do training and get on the leaderboard. And it didn't seem fair to tie that to gift cards or anything like that. So we kept the competition really to the leaderboard.
Okay, thank you. And Don President has a question. And Don, if you revise the question, let me know. Or he asks, how can gamified badges coexist with more serious ones like microcredentials?
I think that's a great question. I don't know that I have a perfect answer to that, except that I think it would have to be the organizational value that you place on a micro-credential. So if you created a micro-credential which people invested a significant amount of time in order to become certified in, say, graphic design, so that they can move to work into the library's graphic design department, then that would have more intrinsic value to the organization and therefore that individual than a badge that was just, sort of a fun or lighthearted thing for completing, so many sessions on stress management. Now, I also think, though, that the pitfall for micro-credentials within public libraries would be that then they would not necessarily be honored if that person moved to a new organization. If someone micro-credentialed, to become a librarian, but they didn't have a library degree, I realize that might be controversial, but just, throwing that out there. Then if they wanted to move to another organization in the future, of course, that micro-credential would likely not have value at another organization. That's a concern.
Okay, thank you. And James O'Donnell has a comment. Credential renewal can be an alternative to simple expiry. You could also have a certain badge that rotates, like Employee of the Month. Emily, do you want to ask your own question? If not, I'll ask, about how much development time did it take you per badge?
Oh, okay. So per badge, I would say probably no more than an hour or two. It kind of really depended on what exactly was involved in the badge. If you're talking about the selection of courses and screening the courses and then putting them together, assigning the point value, some of it was because some of the badges are a little bit more complex than others and have a higher point value, they would take a little longer to complete. But if it was just something like, the LMS we have does have the capability to make people renew things year after year. So if it was just something that would be renewed every year, like reading the personnel policies, a badge associated with that, of course, would be fairly negligible when it came to, time investment.
Thank you. And Scott Lanning has a question. Are you going to take badges public with your programs to the library community?
Oh, that is such a good question. I have heard of people doing that and working on that. And in fact, because we are such an industry heavy county, we have so much manufacturing, a lot of those companies like BMW are starting to explore those kind of options. We have partnered with some different organizations in our state that do things like that. Like SC Works, South Carolina Works is one of the groups that operates in South Carolina, and they're getting into that. So I would like to, but we have not done it yet.
Okay. Sorry about that. I believe that's all the questions that we have. Does anyone else have questions? You want to put it in the chat? Ben Nelson says that, Justice Scott, we have done that with our badging. We use different badges than we do for employees.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there, especially if you have someone move through a computer course at the library, or if you have someone complete maybe a variety of trainings on interviewing or resumes, that you could attach some kind of micro-credential to that, perhaps through Indeed or LinkedIn or one of those external, I know LinkedIn is really getting into it, so I don't use them myself a lot, so I'm not familiar with all of that, but I think that's a good option.
Okay, I don't see any other questions coming through. So again, this presentation is being recorded, and it'll be posted on our digital interest badge webpage, as well as through ACRL. if you want to contact us, we have, again, our library homepage, which you can get from Connect, or excuse me, which we will have on the end of the video, and we will send that to you as well. But as for the presentation, thank you all.
Thank you.
This was a great presentation. I learned quite a bit. I'm thinking about a lot of things right now, and I think some of our participants are thinking about it as well. But again, we will have one more. Maybe I have a question from Ben. Are the badges Jennifer is using open badges?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? I just
Yep.
broke up a
Are the
little bit there.
badges you are using open badges?
Well, and this is where my area of ignorance probably comes in. What do you mean by open badges?
Ben,
mean,
Ben, do you want to provide an example of that?
Yeah, so when I use the term open badges, I just mean they use the open badge metadata framework that Mozilla put together way back in the early days of badging, that allows it to be transferred. I think Dawn was talking about this and the portability of an open badge, being able to move between different backpacks and things like that.
Yes, got it now. Okay. I have heard that term. It's just, again, this is not my area of expertise, really. So no, they're not. They're unique to Docebo and created just by us. At this point, there's no way to transfer the digital badges to anything else. And I suspect that's a flaw in our current system. But I honestly don't know how we would address it at this point beyond perhaps investigating in the future an LMS with a more robust system.
Thank you. And like I said, this concludes our presentation. I just wanted to remind you once again, this is Native Women's Equal Pay Day, and there will be a social media storm at 2 p.m. Eastern Time to raise awareness of the wage gap. Hashtag equal equity for Native women. Hashtag Native Women Equity Pay. Thank you all again for joining us for this presentation, and please look for the recording. And also, if you're interested in joining our group as a convener, keep an eye out for that announcement. Thank you all. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you so much.